Welcome back. You're watching KTN Business Today with me, Abi Agina. And just before the break, we are talking about the state of housing in the country. And our Twitter poll question today, we're asking you, what measures can the government take to make housing cheap and actually accessible? That was our Twitter poll question today. I can see a host of feedback already coming in. And let me just read one quick tweet here. A tweet from... one of the tweets is from Alan Mushoki saying, it shall be like South Africa, where the rich own the land and the poor are concentrated in the so-called affordable housing. Wow, we need the land back. Well, thank you for your feedback. Let's take you now to Ruaka, where the construction sector in the country is just overcoming a lull that came about following the prolonged elections experienced last year. Well, KTN's business reporter Ashley Mazuri is standing by live at a construction site in Ruaka area to get a feel of whether the industry is full steam ahead now that the government is pushing an ambitious plan to deliver affordable housing units to millions of Kenyans. Over to you, Ashley.
Affordable housing is one of the pillars of President Uhuru Kenyatta's Big Four agenda, a pillar that is mainly supposed to relieve Kenyans of the burden of high cost of housing in the country. And in just a few weeks, the president is expected to launch 7 key projects here in Nairobi that are supposed to initiate the beginning of the implementation of this pillar. Right now, I am at Alma site here in Ruaka, a construction site headed by Site and Investment, and we just want to get the perspective of the constructors. With me right now is Johnson Genge, who is a senior manager and regional market, and he's going to be sharing some of those site insights with us. Thank you very much for making time to join us here on KTN News. Why do majority of Kenyans aren't able to access affordable housing?
A couple of things, and thank you for coming to our site at Alma. A couple of things affect ownership of housing in Kenya. If you look at our mortgage, quite low. One of the aspects will be financing. If you look at the offtake side, cost of financing a bit high, so majority are not able to afford the cost of financing a typical mortgage to be able to access a housing. The other aspect will be generally on the other side of development, land cost very high, which puts up to 20 to almost to 30% of any cost of a development. There is the whole issue about construction material also being affected with high prices. There is the whole issue about taxation coming into the whole overall product of that comes out. All these couples up to bringing the costs where they are, of which majority of Kenyans cannot afford. And then, of course, all these things can have a cost, but if also Kenyans who are able to earn more, then they will be able to definitely afford. So there's also the issue about Kenyans' wage or average wages being relatively low.
All right, let's go back to the implementation of the Big Four agenda. And critics have come out saying that the timescales are unrealistic because of the legislative that are supposed to be implemented, but yet they haven't. From your point of view, how true is this or how false is this?
There's quite a number of things to be done that will or need to be in place for affordable housing agenda to progress. We won't say times are not maybe off, not necessarily, because we've seen the effort government is putting in, trying to make sure all the institutionalization around affordable housing comes into effect. We've seen there's a number of legislation, as you say, that needs to be looked into. There's the Sectional Properties Act that needs to be looked into. There's the whole thing about Stamp Duty Act that needs to be looked into. The whole thing about NSSF or the funding around, especially the whole discussion around the NSSF 2013 bill that needs to come into. We also need to recognize that all this requires a framework, of which I think the ministry is really pushing to make sure they come into fruition. The Stamp Duty Act was signed, and the whole thing around the tax rebate to developers was signed a few weeks ago. Yes. You look at the issues to do with this other legislation that needs to come into place. we recognize that there is a whole process of which needs to go to Parliament, needs to be discussed. But we can actually say there's progress going in. And although we are late, according to the whole process, we need to have done at least 200 units this year. It might delay a bit, but in development and with proper structures, funding being there, we can always recover this time.
You've mentioned quite a few things that, of course, are likely to hinder this implementation of the Big Four agenda. As Saitan, as an analyst, what do you think the government should do right now to ensure that the timelines go back to where it's supposed to be?
I think there's quite a number of things that can be done in terms of making sure we accelerate this. One of it will be proper involvement of stakeholders. We've seen, for instance, the proposal to tax employers and employees getting some hitches, or getting some resistance, especially from employers. Is because we need to have a forum where the government is able to involve all stakeholders so that to speed up matters faster. There's also need to try and involve more, especially in the private-public partnership, involve more players so that it's not just the burden of the government to deliver or to make sure they push things. I also think in the spirit of institutionalization, we need to have a proper governance, a board perhaps to oversee this agenda, a whole independent task force that speeds and wake up thinking just about affordable housing. And the whole thing about just making sure that all this is able to be institutionalized and it's able to move.
All right. Nowadays, Kenyans, of course, have different designs in their heads of housing, how they want their houses to look like. Do you think trends should be considered in the building or construction of these houses?
Every Kenyans and every human beings will want aspirational things. Affordability does not necessarily mean cheap. So trends needs to come in. Of course, there's a limit to what extent we can, because we are, the whole agenda is trying to balance affordability in terms of the eventual cost of the product versus affordability aspect. So this, to an extent, you won't expect a jacuzzi in most of these developments,
yes.
But there are those basics. But important, and I think the important thing that all stakeholders involved needs to capture is to make sure that the house is functional. It is able to, it is of high quality, and is able to be functional before we now start bringing in these other so-called styles or aspirations that might. Yeah.
All right. Of course, you've been dealing with the real estate, and you have experience. 6.5 billion was allocated for this period. Do you think it's enough?
If you look at the whole agenda and the papers that proposals the government have come up with, it is still very low. This project will cost all up to about 2.8 trillion Kenya shilling according to the plan. Overall, the provision of what they gave is actually not even 1% of the overall budget for the financial year, but it's a good step given that this is the first time government is actually allocating budgetary for affordable housing and or a direct budget for affordable housing. So this need to look for other ways to bring in money because the allocation that is there by government is not enough. But we've seen a lot of efforts, discussions with World Bank pledging in some money. We've seen African Development Bank pledging in. Other partners needs to come on board and pledge in more money. There's the whole effort about further fundraising through our pensions and our National Social Security Fund. There's also the need to. There's also the whole effort about having a fund through employees and employer contribution, which is a step in the right direction to make sure that this agenda is able to be well funded.
Yes. All right. So apart from, of course, the pillar, what more can be done to help the sector and in Kenyans in general to ensure that they can afford housing?
I think it is to carry the entire market all together in terms of involving local developers in supporting the government effort. There's a whole need about making sure that there's offtake, because that's the other thing, and making sure that even as we organize for funds to do mortgages to Kenyans, we are able to bring down the interest rate to perhaps a single digit to be able to allow for mass affordability. Otherwise, as Saiton, we support government efforts in coming up with affordable housing agenda, and yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Johnson Genge there, a senior manager, regional markets at Saiton Investments. As you've heard from him, of course, there's so many challenges that are hindering this pillar, but of course, it is achievable once all these are put right into place. I am Ashley Mazuri from here at the Alma site in Ruaka. Back to you.
Many thanks, Ashley, for putting a face to this conversation. And let me still throw some questions quickly as we wrap up to Kiprono. Of course, one of the big things we are seeing is that the government has tried to give a different policy twist, where we are seeing employers are being asked to contribute as well as employees by putting in 500 shillings to the housing fund. Of course, there are questions being raised that will this really work? Will the money not be stolen? And is it a good idea in the first place?
That's a tricky one, because I've said it many times that I think that Kenya we are too highly taxed. And I've many times also said that on multiple platforms that there needs to be a more concerted effort by government to broaden the tax base. Otherwise, we run the risk of really killing the goose that lays the golden egg. But having said that, in the session that we had with P.S. Hinga last week, he talked about multiple ways that they're intending to raise capital. And, you know, as a board member of the Nairobi Securities Exchange, we this morning had a meeting, and I was also glad to hear that the Securities Exchange is looking at a REITs model to raise capital to fund these projects. And the PS also told us about a revolving fund that will also, you know, guarantee uptake. But I think, you know, this is a legacy project for President Kenyatta. And he has 4 years to go. And it's one of the things that he wants to achieve. And I think for me, apart from the commercial side, which is the money making by the private sector to ensure that they get a reasonable return for their investments, there's also the social aspect in terms of actually meeting one of the aspirations of Vision 2030, which is to make dignify Kenyans by actually allowing them to own their own homes.
All right. Yeah. Many thanks, Kiprono.
Thank you.
A very busy man, and thank you for sparing time for us.
Thank you, and come tomorrow.